Green and rugged, Botetourt County, Virginia, abuts the Blue Ridge Mountains midway along the famous Appalachian Trail, dotted with a host of unincorporated farming towns on the border between modern civilization and ancient wilderness. In December of 1933, several families within the county claimed to be victims of a bizarre series of attacks by unknown assailants. Who were these assailants? Or, as has been suggested by some, could there have been another explanation? Could these attacks have been nothing more than a hysterical fantasy? In the rural community of Haymakertown, farm laborer Cal Huffman and his wife were about to retire to the upstairs of their rented farmhouse, an 18th century structure situated a short distance away from the residence of the landlords, Kent and Eva Henderson. Inexplicably, Mrs. Huffman suddenly became aware of a powerful odor permeating the lower floor of the house and quickly nauseated. It seemed as though a strange gas was wafting through the air. After a few moments, the gas dissipated, Mrs. Huffman's unpleasant sensation subsided, and Mr. Huffman bid her good night, deciding to keep watch on the ground floor, shotgun in hand. The source of the gas was a mystery, but being amply familiar with the myriad smells on a farm, it was a reasonable assumption the source was somewhere outside. Could someone be trying to break in? Perhaps the gas was an unorthodox way of incapacitating the residents. According to a later report, Mr. Huffman sat quietly for approximately 45 minutes, watching and listening. Local climatological records indicate it had been unseasonably warm and that the ground outside was perhaps only dusted with 2 to 3 inches of snow. Not enough to impede anyone with ill intentions, certainly, but probably more than enough to render any attempts at stealth near impossible. There had been no sounds of movement and no indications someone was trying to enter through a door or a window. At about this time, the suspicious farmer noticed an odd smell. He immediately realized that the mysterious gas had re-entered the house and was now filling the first floor. Being without a telephone, a common circumstance in 1930s Virginia, and undoubtedly wanting to catch the culprits more or less red-handed, Mr. Huffman bolted out the front door and dashed to his landlord's house to call the police. At about midnight, a Botetourt County officer by the name of Oscar Dean Lemon arrived at the Huffmans and took statements from both Cal and his wife. Understandably concerned, Officer Lemon then stayed for the remainder of the hour, hoping to nab a suspected prowler. The effort proved fruitless, however, and Officer Lemon finally left. With a parting suggestion, they contact him again if anything more should happen. No sooner had the patrol car's lights vanished in the cold night than a third bout of gas filled the house, this time leaching into the upstairs bedrooms, affecting not only Mr. and Mrs. Huffman, but all of their 6 children as well, including 19-year-old Alice Huffman, who was briefly rendered unconscious. Desperate for relief, Mrs. Huffman busied herself with opening every window as her husband returned to the Hendersons, this time calling Dr. S.F. Driver, a physician from the nearby town of Troutville, about 8 miles distant. Dr. Driver arrived to find the house freezing cold and Alice Huffman in a less than ideal state. He managed to resuscitate her, and after examining each of the other household members to find them more or less healthy, he left. It is interesting to note that despite the Huffman family describing a distinct odor during the attacks, Dr. Driver reported nothing out of the ordinary in that regard. Of course, if the house had been completely open to the frigid December air for any length of time, any noxious fumes could have been vented before the doctor arrived. Nevertheless, several symptoms were presented by the Huffmans, including nausea, headache, facial swelling, and constriction of nasal passages and throat. Determined to get to the bottom of the matter, Mr. Huffman quickly enlisted the help of the Hendersons' son, Ashby, the two standing guard until dawn. No further gassing occurred, but sometime during the morning, one or both of the men claimed to have seen someone running away from the house. Considering what could be described as mounting paranoia and the deep darkness, the moon having set just after midnight, this is probably not a very reliable observation. After sunrise, Officer Lemon returned to the Huffman residence, accompanied by a Dr. Breckenridge from the town of Fincastle. After a search of the grounds, Officer Lemon and Mr. Huffman discovered the print of a woman's shoe beneath a window, possibly a site where gas could have entered the house. Another similar print was found beneath a porch. The men theorized the assailant may have hidden there between attacks. Later it was surmised that whatever gas was used, if any, was likely not ether, chloroform, or any type of tear gas, such as xylobromide, which is often described as pleasant-smelling, or ethyl bromoacetate, which is usually described as overpoweringly fruity. Specifically, Dr. Breckenridge openly considered the idea of the gas being carbon dioxide, a relatively common substance even in the 1930s in the form of dry ice. Carbon dioxide was commonly used to subdue smaller farm animals to prepare them either for slaughter or capture. This could easily account for some of the symptoms, such as headache. But carbon dioxide is generally colorless, odorless, and tasteless, facts diametrically at odds with reports from both the Huffmans and others. Despite the best efforts of Dr. Driver, Alice Huffman continued to exhibit symptoms of a nebulous illness, even experiencing convulsions for several weeks afterwards, although medical experts continually attributed her condition to psychological stress. A few miles away in the town of Cloverdale, Mr. and Mrs. Clarence and Lucy Hall and their children Daniel and Hattie had just returned home from a Christmas Eve church service. Upon entering their front door, all four of them were hit with a distinctively pungent odor that they later described as sickening. Additionally, all of them reported experiencing a sudden sweet taste on their tongues, eye pain, and nausea, symptoms reminiscent of those encountered by the Huffmans 2 days earlier. Mr. Hall surmised the odor was emanating from a room at the far end of the house. As he went toward the source, he became visibly distressed and began to stumble. A quick-thinking Lucy grabbed her husband and drug him back onto the front porch, clearing his head with fresh winter air. Deciding to stay elsewhere for the night, the Halls hurried down the road to the house of Lucy Hall's mother and telephoned to the local sheriff. Deputies soon arrived, bringing along the aforementioned Dr. Breckenridge and another doctor by the name of Easley. Upon entering the vacant house, the doctors immediately smelled a distinctly sweet odor, reminding them of formaldehyde, a chemical commonly used in embalming and the manufacture and processing of textiles. A search of the grounds revealed a window that appeared to have been nailed shut at one time, and that had said nail recently removed from the outside by an unknown party. When questioned about this, Mrs. Hall explained that the house had in fact been burglarized the previous summer. The burglar, who was never caught, had stealthily broke a lock on one of the entry doors and entered, but oddly had not stolen anything. This, of course, assumes Mrs. Hall's recollection is accurate, and that there was no other explanation for why said lock would be damaged. Then again, there is no indication Mrs. Hall had a reputation for paranoia or falsehoods, so perhaps it is best to take the report at face value. However, the window in question was not involved in the earlier burglary, and its connection is admittedly assumptive. The Halls spent Christmas Day back at home, attempting to regain some semblance of normalcy, but by sundown they had returned to the house of Mrs. Hall's mother, as they were still leery of a prowler. Ignorant of the Halls' return to their temporary accommodations, the sister and brother-in-law of Lucy Hall drove up to the residence at about 8 p.m., intent on offering a place to sleep for the night. Despite the house being dark and vacant, the couple later recalled seeing an unknown individual with a flashlight skulking around the outside of the house, the same area where investigators had found the suspiciously tampered window. In the town of Troutville, a welder by the name of A.L. Kelly reported a gas attack at his residence while he was in an upstairs bedroom. Curiously, although both Mr. Kelly and his mother were in the house that evening, he was the only person in the house to experience any symptoms. Mr. Kelly also reported a suspicious-looking automobile nearby, though one man's suspicion is hardly evidence. Events would take a remarkably disturbing turn 2 weeks later in the tiny community of Howell Mills, while Mr. Homer Hilton and his wife were upstairs in bed and their boarders, a Mrs. Moore and her infant, were resting quietly in the living room. Just after 10 p.m., Mrs. Moore claimed to hear the sound of voices coming from outside, from a nearby road. After a moment, the voices seemed to draw closer to the house, particularly toward a window covered by a drawn shade, which had been missing a section of glass for some time and was for all intents and purposes open to the cold winter air. Mrs. Moore's curiosity turned to horror as a strange noise emanated from the window, and the shade moved as if being pushed on from behind. The room suddenly began to fill with noxious fumes. Upstairs, Mr. and Mrs. Hilton were apparently unaffected by any gas and had no inkling of the goings-on 1 floor below them until they heard their young boarders' cries of alarm. Nevertheless, likely aware of a gasser prowling the county via write-ups in a local newspaper or simple word of mouth, Mr. Hilton telephoned to the sheriff and subsequently warned his neighbors, Emmett and Laura Lee, to be on the lookout. Standing in his upstairs window, undoubtedly on edge as he stood guard over his wife and 10 children, Mr. Lee apparently fired a warning shot into the air from a shotgun after he thought he heard someone prowling around a short time later. No trace of any prowler was ever found, and when questioned by deputies, neither Mrs. Moore nor the Hiltons could conceive of any possible motive for an attack. Because of, or in spite of, recently reported gas attacks, Mr. George K. Pogue contacted authorities to report a series of suspicious events at his house at around the same time as the attack on the Hiltons. While walking home from an earlier engagement, Mr. Pogue's teenage daughter, Grace, had seen several boys loitering on the side of the road, an unusual occurrence so far from town and at such a late hour. Later, the entire family claimed to have heard both an automobile slowly drive past their home and several indistinct voices nearby. One source indicates one or more of the Pogues not only heard the car, but saw one as well, specifically a 1933 Chevrolet in which a man and a woman were seated. Mr. G.D. Kinsey, a resident of Troutville, reported a gas attack similar to others, and was partly investigated by Dr. Driver, the physician who had helped investigate the Huffman incident several days before. Official records note Dr. Driver as stating the substance used in the Kinsey residence had positively been chlorine gas, although sometime later Dr. Driver claimed that he had in fact been misquoted and had only noted that the symptoms observed in the Kinsey household, blurred vision, burning sensation in the sinuses, and shortness of breath, were consistent with chlorine gas. The following day, a lead in an article printed in the Roanoke Times breathlessly opined, quote, "Nocturnal dispensers of a nauseating and benumbing gas went abroad in Botetourt County again," unquote. The following Tuesday, Mr. Price Duvall was driving northbound toward his home in the town of Cloverdale when he passed a man running alongside of the road toward an idling car. When he arrived home at approximately 11:30 p.m., he was informed by his wife Glenna that the family had been victim of a gas attack. Officer Lemon once again dutifully arrived, and thinking there may be a link between the two incidents, he and Mr. Duvall drove to the section of road where the latter had witnessed the man and parked a car. Armed with only a thin crescent moon and a police flashlight, the two men were unable to locate any clues in the darkness, although the following morning Officer Lemon returned and discovered a series of footprints where the mysterious car had been parked. Strangely, the footprints appeared to be made by a woman's shoe. On January 19th, in Carvin's Cove, a retired magistrate with the last name of Campbell and his wife reported being inundated by a noxious vapor. Interestingly, Mrs. Campbell was reported sitting next to a window when she noticed a curtain move in a manner similar to that of the shade of the Hilton house several days earlier. Although a seemingly minor detail, this claim leads to a strange incongruence. In Botetourt County, the temperature at that time of year at that hour ranges typically between the low to high 30s Fahrenheit. There is no indication said curtain was covering missing glass like that at the Hiltons, and to willingly sit beside a window open to freezing air is somewhat idiosyncratic, to say the least. Regardless, keenly aware of the repeated attacks over the previous month, and desperate to catch someone brazen enough to assault a former officer of the court, Bot-A-TOT and neighboring Roanoke County Sheriff's Departments quickly set up blockades across any roads leaving Carvin's Cove. Despite this rather unprecedented effort, the attempt to capture the mysterious person or persons failed. A series of attacks followed over the successive days, the main body of which found their way into the printed pages of the Roanoke Times and the Roanoke World News. The growing story was even given a brief mention in the prestigious New York Times, including a statement that the gas used had been identified as chlorine gas, no doubt a supposition based on the erroneous record made regarding Dr. Driver, and that the guilty party had used either a gas gun or capsule as a delivery system. Near the Duvall residence that had been attacked 4 nights earlier, Mr. Howard Crawford and his wife entered their home after returning from an evening away to be quickly overcome by fumes of some mysterious gas. Coughing, the couple managed to get the attention of their neighbor, Kent Skaggs, who quickly ran down the road to another neighbor and called the police. Officer Lemon, Dr. Driver, and a deputy sheriff by the name of Zimmerman, who was one of the orchestrators of the failed roadblock of January 19th, soon arrived and began an investigation. As before, Driver theorized the gas used may have been chlorine, considering the symptoms experienced by the Crawfords, who were still feeling effects while being examined. A search of the grounds of the Crawford home did turn up an interesting find. a starter crank for an overland automobile company vehicle, which had stopped production in 1926. Once again outside the town of Cloverdale and cognizant of a prowling gasser terrorizing the county, Chester Snyder was startled awake by his barking dog and rushed downstairs to investigate. Grabbing a shotgun, Snyder bolted out the front door, and, he later claimed to the beleaguered Deputy Zimmerman, immediately spotted a man skulking around in a ditch across the road. Snyder opened fire and hurried back into the house to retrieve more ammunition. When he returned, the shadowy figure had disappeared. Moments later, a car slowly crawled up the road, momentarily pausing in front of his house. When asked, Snyder could not recall the make or model, as he was dazzled by the bright headlamps. Deputy Zimmerman later searched the area and found what appeared to be a set of footprints that led from the road through a nearby field and to the ditch. Further tracks indicated someone had left the ditch and approached Mr. Snyder's house, only to double back suddenly. Ed Stanley and his wife were entertaining a trio of guests at their home between Cloverdale and Troutville when all 5 individuals became aware of a strange odor filling the house. Mr. Stanley was soon overwhelmed and began to have trouble breathing as they all hurried outdoors. One of the guests, a Mrs. Weddle, was so affected she had to be carried. While outside, another of the guests, Frank Guy, claimed to have seen 4 men running toward a nearby patch of woods. Mr. Guy hastily retrieved a firearm from the Stanleys' residence and directed a shot into the trees. Though nothing came of any investigation into the matter, the disturbing increase in potentially lethal retaliations was not lost on authorities. In an interview with the Roanoke Times, Officer Lemon ominously surmised, quote, "I know how this is going to end. Some innocent person is going to be killed," unquote. In February of 1934, several homes in and around Roanoke, a modest city just on the other side of the southwestern border of Botetourt County, claimed to have been visited by the mysterious gasser, who seemed to have become substantially, and counterintuitively, bolder in his attacks, as town streets afforded much less secrecy and opportunity for escape. In the nearby community of Vinton, Beverly Bohone was in the living room of her home on Patterson Avenue with her mother and sister when a sulfurous smell seeped into the house. At the same time, their next-door neighbor, Mrs. Cage, was certain someone had injected gas through the gap beneath the house's entry door while she was upstairs giving her children a bath. On February 8th, Mrs. Milan of Rohrer Avenue, oddly only about a block away from the houses of the aforementioned Mrs. Bohone and Mrs. Cage, stated she noticed a strange odor emanating from the front door. This was apparently confirmed by Mrs. Milan's daughter as well as her neighbor, who had dropped by for an unscheduled visit. Police were called, and a short time later, Roanoke Police Detective W.C. Tate, Roanoke County Sheriff Richardson, and a doctor by the name of Johnson arrived to look into the matter. No physical evidence was found at the Milan home, though both Detective Tate and Sheriff Richardson confirmed an odd, unrecognizable smell. Dr. Johnson, on the other hand, did not note any unusual odors, though he was the last to arrive, and the house may have completely vented by that time. He did, however, examine the victims, who were complaining of nebulous symptoms. It was of the good doctor's opinion that whatever had leached into the house had not likely been sulfur, chlorine, or a lacrimatory agent such as tear gas, as no one who was exposed seemed to be experiencing irritation to the eyes. Nevertheless, Mrs. Milan was taken to a nearby hospital for observation, where she was briefly visited by the omnipresent Officer Lemon, as he had continued to follow the case, even as it moved out of his jurisdiction. At around 8 p.m. on or about February 9th, a Ms. Langford claimed to have taken extremely ill after a gas attack at her house in Garden City. An hour later, a man called police with a report of a foul smell in his house that affected both himself and one of his 2 children. Strangely, neither his wife nor his other child seemed to notice anything unusual. Concurrently, Mr. Joseph Clay telephoned the police from a local drugstore, describing how, a few minutes prior, he had gone into his kitchen to investigate the sound of his back porch door slamming shut, only to be nearly overwhelmed by toxic fumes. On another evening, a Mr. and Mrs. Patterson reported a gas attack. Police were quick to investigate, though they found nothing. After leaving their home, the Pattersons called again and reported another attack. Once again, the police investigated, and once again, they went away empty-handed. Such was the case with the majority of calls throughout the following days. Police reports citing shadowy figures and strange cars with darkened headlamps, mysterious people milling about the neighborhoods like specters bent on evil deeds. The alleged gassings, as well as public frustration, would reach a crescendo in the remainder of the month. By Sunday, February 11th, no fewer than 19 calls were made to local authorities, all claiming to have been besieged by a mysterious gas-wielding prowler. The final article about the matter was printed in the Roanoke World News on February 18th, indicating a growing sentiment in police departments that the entire affair was nothing more than mass hysteria and had no basis in reality. Because of, or despite this, reports of the gasser diminished within a week, the Virginia countryside once again returning to the quiet life of Depression-era America.